to lead, I'm sorry, Chris, to talk about the science measures.
Okay, we should return to the main presentation if it's, yeah, great. I wanted to begin with a list of the science briefings that the subcommittee has received, and I now see Ed's issue with the size of the display that I have, so bear with me for just a moment. The subcommittee received a suite of briefings on science at various destinations in the solar system. There was a set of 4 different briefings on science on the moon. Those included a briefing on scientific findings relevant to human outposts or settlements on the moon, that is to say lunar resources. A briefing that focused on science about the moon, lunar geology primarily. Science that could be done from the moon, whether that's astronomy, solar and space physics, or earth science. And finally, we had a short briefing on using the moon as a planetary protection testbed for Mars exploration, since planetary protection will be a challenge when humans go to Mars. We also received briefings on science at space destinations, so not science on particular worlds, but science that could be done in free space. And one of those briefings we asked to emphasize the contrast between the scientific advantages, between the science that one would do on the surface of the moon and the science that one would do in free space. There was also a discussion of the role that humans can play in servicing scientific missions in free space. A brief discussion of the contrast between robotic and astronaut maintenance of those missions, although that is a kind of trade that is currently underway at the Goddard Space Flight Center and will not report out for another year. We reviewed science at near-Earth objects, most important from the point of view of human civilization, Earth-crossing objects, asteroids and comets that cross the orbit of the Earth. We looked at the science of those objects and also possible missions to those objects. Okay. That's very good. We, in addition, we reviewed science at Mars, both from Mars but primarily on the Martian surface. And we benefited from some presentations of overall scientific objectives, including one from the Planetary Society, which briefed their new roadmap for human exploration to us. One of the other subcommittees reviewed science that can be done at the station. That was outside of our purview, but I wanted to include it in this list so that it's clear that we were looking at the role science will play across the human spaceflight program. Finally, when this committee holds its public meeting on August 5th, it will be briefed on 4 broad topics. There are 4 decadal surveys that incorporate a vast amount of input from the scientific community in 4 different areas of science: astronomy and astrophysics, earth sciences, biological and physical sciences, and planetary science. That is to say, the role that each of those plays in space exploration. These are coordinated by the National Academy of Sciences. One of those, the decadal survey in earth sciences, is complete. The other 3 are underway. We need to be careful. Of course, the chairs of those committees will not be able to brief us on results when there is still a consensus being forged within the community. But of course, the committee needs to benefit from that work as much as possible, because those decadal surveys really are the place where these scientific communities forge agreement on what the key objectives in space in those areas of science are. And finally, I want to note, with respect to our information gathering, that we have received, I think the slide says considerable, I would say enormous input from scientists and others outside of the committee and outside of these formal bodies about what our scientific objectives in space ought to be. I am particularly deluged with such input, and I welcome it. I've been trying to read as much of it as possible. I should add that in addition to these to the 4 decadal surveys, there are quite a few other documents that have been produced in the last few years that represent one or another sub-community's point of view about scientific priorities in the solar system. We have a few findings to present to the committee with respect to science beyond low Earth orbit. The first is that there are certainly some cases where astronauts enable science at a pace that rapidly eclipses what robotic missions can achieve. In particular, that's true in field geology, and especially on Mars and the Moon, and probably on near-Earth objects as well. It's striking that some of the scientists who are most deeply involved with robotic exploration of those objects are among the biggest advocates for sending humans, because they're, as competent field geologists, they're painfully aware of the comparative limitations of the robotic craft. Of course, that has to be tempered with the statement that there is an impressive disparity in cost between robotic and human missions. A second finding is that astronomy that 4 decades ago it would have made sense to do from the Moon is often now, and I would say nearly always now, clearly better done from free-flying platforms in space, often at Lagrange points. We know how to do that now, and the Moon, in contrast, provides disadvantages rather than comparative advantages. The servicing of astronomy missions by astronauts, as opposed to robotic servicing of those missions, is being studied. There's a study underway at Goddard. The results of that are still a year out. And finally, and we want to emphasize this, given our current knowledge of the effects of galactic cosmic rays on humans, both with respect to long-term cancers and also with respect to damage to important organs, and also coupled to that, the current lifetime radiation limits that the program understandably imposes for astronauts, and coupled to that, the very strong limitations on our ability to provide physical shielding against galactic cosmic rays, as opposed to, say, solar particle events. Human Mars missions cannot now be flown. The current limits, these vary by age and gender, but the current limits that the galactic cosmic ray background puts on the duration of human missions in deep space is something like 200 days. That's the time it takes to either get to Mars or come back from Mars. And therefore, research on understanding these effects, reducing the associated uncertainties, which are still quite large, and examining biological and physical mitigation measures needs to be prioritized. Let me close these remarks with a discussion of the science figures of merit that we're adopting in our, that we recommend to the committee to be adopted when evaluating different scenarios on the basis of science. First, I'll just note that when I say science now in this context, I mean fundamental science. There's clearly very important scientific research to be done regarding humans in space, understanding radiation, the effects of zero or low gravity environments, and other crew-oriented effects. Those are very important to apply as figures of merit, but we are bookkeeping those elsewhere in our chart of 11 figures of merit. Our criterion in this row is that the scientific outcomes of particular scenarios should significantly and appropriately address important established priorities of the scientific community, including astrophysics, planetary and lunar science, solar science, and earth science. And the criterion, the demarcation criterion among different scenarios would be whether the scenario doesn't accomplish that at all, whether it addresses at least some established priorities of the scientific community, some priorities, or many of the important established priorities. Ultimately, those priorities will need to be referred to the priorities brought forward by the decadal survey priorities. Until the decadal surveys are finalized, for those that are still underway, we will have to do our best with the existing older decadal surveys and other documents from the community, such as the scientific context for the exploration of the Moon and many other documents analogous to that are in the literature, in trying to piece together our best account of the established priorities of the community. Thank you. Ed, the floor is yours.